There's a strange silence that lives beneath modern life. You can't quite hear it until everything else fades. No phone notifications, no background music, no new episode to binge, no one to impress. And in that silence, something ancient stirs. Not peace, not joy, but a subtle ache. It isn't loud, it doesn't scream, it whispers. A kind of restlessness that no weekend getaway seems to fix. An unease that returns even after the next paycheck, the next hug, the next dream fulfilled. Most people never notice it, not because it's not there, but because it's always been there. We've built lives around ignoring it. Layer after layer of distraction, busyness, stimulation. We scroll, we consume, we perform, and we tell ourselves, I'm okay, I'm fine, this is normal. But what if this normal is the very prison? He wakes up, checks his phone before even opening both eyes. A quick scan, messages, markets, memes. Coffee brewing, emails flooding, meetings stacked. He's successful, busy, respected. From the outside, he's living the dream. But in the quiet moments, when the applause fades, when the screen turns black, he feels it, a hollow space inside. Like he's constantly chasing something he can't name. He brushes it off, calls it stress. Tells himself it'll get better once he finishes the next project. Once he finally takes that vacation. Once he makes just a little more. But no matter how fast he runs, it's always one step behind. That emptiness. That invisible weight. He doesn't know he's suffering, because his suffering doesn't look like pain. It looks like success. It looks like having it all. It looks like life. This is the hidden prison, a cage with golden walls and velvet cushions. So comfortable, so familiar, you forget it's a cage at all. You move within it. You build dreams inside it. You grow old in it. And never once question, am I free? The Buddha called this dukkha, suffering, dissatisfaction, unease. But not just the sharp pains of life. Not just grief, heartbreak, loss. No, the Buddha pointed to something much deeper, a kind of existential itch. The tension of constantly seeking, constantly striving, constantly running away from. Silence. Imagine being born into a room with dim lighting. You've never seen daylight, never questioned the walls. You decorate the space. You adjust to its limits. You even call it home. Then one day, a crack appears in the wall. And for the first time, a sliver of sunlight pierces through. Suddenly, you realize you've been in the dark all along. That's what awakening begins to feel like. Not a grand explosion of enlightenment, but a subtle cracking of illusion. We suffer because we don't know we're suffering. And we don't know because we've mistaken numbness for peace, distraction for joy, stimulation for meaning. The mind is clever. It adapts, it rationalizes, it protects. It says, everyone feels this way. This is just adulthood. This is how life is. But truth doesn't bend to comfort. And peace, real peace, doesn't come from pretending. In Buddhism, this is called avijja, ignorance, not stupidity. Not lack of intelligence, but a fundamental blindness, a me-seeing of reality. And that blindness isn't just intellectual, it's experiential. You don't know you're lost until you start finding the way. You don't know you're asleep until you begin to wake. Many people spend their whole lives searching for the right life. The right job, the right person, the right country, the right version of themselves. But the spiritual path doesn't begin when we change careers or cities. It begins when we turn inward, when we stop asking, what's next? And start asking, what is this? What is this constant tug inside my chest? What is this dissatisfaction that doesn't go away no matter what I achieve? What is thigh? She smiles in every photo, knows how to angle her face just right, always adds a quote that sounds positive, something about gratitude or growth. Her friends say she's strong, that she's glowing, that she has it all together. But what they don't see What she barely notices is how often she avoids silence, how she scrolls not for fun but to escape, how each night she feels a strange emptiness that no amount of likes, messages, or affirmations can fill. He's a father, a husband, a manager. He jokes at lunch meetings, pays his bills on time, plays with his kids on weekends. He loves his family, truly. But sometimes when he's alone, he stares into space and feels like a stranger in his own skin. He doesn't talk about it, not because he's hiding, but because he doesn't even have the words. This is just life, right? You wake up, you work, you eat, you rest, you repeat. Somewhere along the way, he traded aliveness for functionality. And the trade was so slow, so silent, that he didn't even notice it happening. That's how suffering hides, not as screams or scars, but as routines, as expectations, as what we call normal. We've been taught to believe that if we're not crying, not broken, not screaming into the void, then we're okay. But there's a kind of pain that doesn't leave visible wounds, a kind that lingers beneath the surface, subtle, persistent, invisible, and it hides behind smiles, busy schedules, and full calendars. It hides behind degrees, promotions, gym memberships, and Sunday brunches. It hides because it can. In the Buddha's time, suffering was easier to see. People lived close to nature, close to death. Illness, aging, and impermanence were everywhere, raw, unfiltered. But in our time, we've built a world that masks everything uncomfortable. Feeling sad, here's a new show. Feeling lonely, here's an app. Feeling lost, buy something. We've become experts at distraction, masters of emotional anesthesia. And because we rarely allow space for discomfort, we've forgotten what unfiltered life even feels like. But the truth is, most people are not okay. Most people carry silent wounds, not from wars or disasters, but from disconnection. Disconnected from their bodies, from their breath, from stillness, from themselves. And because everyone around them seems just as numb, just as distracted, just as tired beneath the smiles, they assume it's normal. And when suffering becomes normal, it becomes invisible. This is the great illusion of modern life. That functionality equals wellness. That looking fine is the same as being fine. But functioning isn't thriving. Smiling isn't healing. Coping isn't peace. There's a reason Buddhist teachings begin not with bliss, but with dukkha, the noble truth of suffering. Not to depress us, not to shame us, but to wake us up. Because the first step to freedom isn't solving the suffering. It's seeing it without judgment, without resistance, without running, just seeing. Think of a pond. On the surface, it looks still, clear, peaceful, but stir it even slightly and the mud rises. You see the depth. The things that were always there, just hidden beneath still waters. That's what mindfulness does. It doesn't create the suffering. It reveals what's already there. And that revelation is both terrifying and liberating. Because once you see, you can't unsee. Once you name the ache, you begin to loosen its grip. But here's the catch: we don't want to see. Not because we're weak, but because we're scared. Scared that if we stop performing, we'll be rejected. Scared that if we stop moving, we'll fall apart. Scared that if we feel the truth of our suffering, it will consume us. So we keep the mask on, keep smiling, keep pretending, because pretending feels safer than plunging into the unknown. It doesn't start with pain, it starts with belief. The moment we're born, the world hands us a script, a name, a role, a story. You are this. You must do that. If you want love, be like this. If you want to matter, become that. And before we can even form full thoughts, we begin building our identity with bricks we didn't choose. Not because we're wrong, but because we don't know any better. We inherit the mind of the world. And that is the beginning of the trap. The Buddha called it avijja, ignorance, but not just ignorance of facts. ignorance of truth, not seeing things as they really are. It's not that we refuse to see, it's that we've never questioned what we're seeing. We mistake the map for the territory, the label for the thing, the thought for reality, and once the mind clings to illusion, it becomes a prisoner in its own castle. Let's pause here. Have you ever watched a child play pretend? They're fully inside their story. A cardboard box becomes a spaceship. A stick becomes a sword. They laugh, fight, cry, all inside a world they created. Now imagine that child never grows out of the game. Imagine they reach adulthood still believing the box is a ship. Still defending it, protecting it, terrified of losing it. That's us. That's the mind. We've mistaken our thoughts for truths, our identities for absolutes, our roles for who we really are. And we don't know it because everyone around us is doing the same. The mind doesn't trap itself out of malice. It does so out of fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of groundlessness. Fear that if we let go of who we think we are, we'll become nothing. So it builds layer after layer. I am my job. I am my personality. I am my story. I am my pain. I am my opinions. And then it clings to identity, to belief, to control, to certainty. But here's the catch. Everything the mind clings to changes. Jobs end. Bodies age. People leave. Stories shift. Even beliefs evolve. And when you cling to what changes, suffering becomes inevitable. It's like trying to hold water in your hands. The tighter you grip, the faster it slips through. This is the great mechanism of suffering, attachment to illusion, clinging to what is fleeting, mistaking the impermanent for the permanent, and we do it over and over, because we don't realize we're doing it. So how does the trap sustain itself? Through repetition, through reinforcement, through unconscious habit. Every time we chase pleasure or avoid discomfort, we reinforce the belief, this is who I am. This is what I need to be okay. The mind becomes a looping machine, craving, resisting, judging, comparing over and over again. And the longer the loop spins, the more solid the illusion feels, like a groove etched into a vinyl record, playing the same song, louder each time. In Buddhism, this cycle is called samsara, the endless wandering, not just across lifetimes, but moment to moment. Each thought, each reaction, each grasping is a tiny reincarnation, a rebirth into illusion. And the root of it all, not evil, not weakness, just unawareness. A mind that doesn't see its own movements, a heart that forgets its own depth, a being that confuses the mask for the face. There's a Zen saying, when a pickpocket meets a saint, all he sees are pockets. It's not about morality. It's about perception. You don't see the world as it is. You see the world as you are. If the mind is cloudy, the world is stormy. If the mind is restless, silence feels threatening. If the mind is afraid, love looks dangerous. So the trap is not outside. It's internal. And as long as we seek freedom through external rearrangement, we stay bound by our own misunderstanding. But there's hope in this too, because if the trap is internal, so is TH. There's a strange paradox in human nature. We say we want peace but chase chaos. We long for love but sabotage connection. We crave freedom but run back to what enslaves us. Why? Why do we return again and again to the very habits, thoughts, and relationships that leave us empty? Why do we cling to what hurts? The answer doesn't lie in logic, it lies in familiarity. What we know we trust, even if it's killing us. It's why someone raised in violence may find peace uncomfortable, why someone who grew up in chaos feels uneasy in silence. The mind would rather suffer in the known than risk peace in the unknown. Let's say you've been walking with a stone in your shoe for years. At first it hurts, but after a while your foot adjusts. You walk differently. You limp a little maybe, but it becomes your normal. Then one day, someone offers to help remove the stone, and for a moment you hesitate, because the stone has become part of your walk, part of your rhythm, part of you. Taking it out doesn't just change how you feel. It changes who you are, and that's terrifying. In Buddhism, this is known as upadana, clinging, not just to objects but to identity, to emotion, to pain, to roles, to stories. We cling not because we're weak, but because we believe these things define us. I am the strong one. I am the victim. I am the achiever. I am the broken one. We wrap ourselves in these identities, like armor, but the armor becomes a cage, and soon we're not sure who we are without it. Have you ever seen someone sabotage their own healing? They finally meet someone kind, and they push them away. They find a moment of stillness, and immediately reach for distraction. They begin to feel peace, and suddenly crave drama. It's not because they want to suffer, it's because suffering is familiar, and familiarity feels like safety. Even when it is, the ego is addicted to control, and peace requires surrender. That's why inner stillness can feel threatening. It dissolves the boundaries the ego worked so hard to build. It whispers, "You are not your story. You are not your trauma. You are not your titles or failures." And the ego, terrified of its own death, fights back. It convinces you that healing is dangerous, that you'll lose yourself. But in truth, you're only losing who you never really were. There's also another layer. Pleasure, even toxic pleasure, creates momentary relief. The brain rewards you for distraction, for control, for chasing. That dopamine hit from a like, that surge of power in an argument, that comfort food, that numbing show. Each one becomes a thread in the web of addiction. And soon we mistake relief for peace. But relief is temporary, it fades. And what's left? The same old ache, deeper than before. This is the suffering the Buddha pointed to. Not just pain, but the endless cycle of reaching, clinging, grasping, and never being satisfied. It's not that life refuses to give us what we want. It's that we're looking in the wrong place, outside, always outside, when the real peace we seek has been quietly waiting inside all along. But clinging isn't just personal, it's collective. Our culture rewards addiction to speed, to status, to productivity. We wear burnout like a badge, confuse busyness with worth, treat anxiety like a lifestyle. And in that noise, it's easy to forget who we are. We become what we chase, and what we chase often is emptiness in disguise. The good news: clinging isn't permanent, it's a habit. And like any habit, it can be seen, understood, and released, but not through willpower alone, not through guilt or shame, through awareness, through compassion, through presence. Imagine this: instead of reacting to discomfort, you pause, you feel that. There is a place inside you where nothing ever hurts, where no craving arises, no identity clings, no past or future weighs heavy. This place is not far. It's not hidden in a monastery, not buried in some distant mountain cave. It's here right now, in the space between thoughts. Most people never notice it. They live on the surface of the mind, thought after thought, emotion after emotion, like waves crashing endlessly on the shore, each moment filled with noise. What's next? Am I enough? Why did that happen? Will I be okay? We are addicted to thinking, so much so that silence feels unnatural, uncomfortable, empty. But that emptiness, that terrifying quiet, is actually the doorway we've been searching for. Imagine your mind as a vast sky. Thoughts are just clouds, some dark, some bright, some fast, some slow. But no matter how many clouds drift by, the sky remains untouched. It doesn't cling, it doesn't judge, it simply is. That sky, pure, wide, still, is your true nature. And it's most visible in the spaces where thoughts fall silent. We rarely pause to witness it. We think silence is the absence of something, but in reality, silence is presence itself. When the mind becomes still, even for a breath, you begin to see, not with your eyes but with awareness, and in that seeing, a truth arises. You are not your thoughts, you are not your feelings, you are not the voice in your head that narrates, compares, plans, regrets. You are the space in which all of that comes and goes. You are awareness itself. Buddhist masters have long taught that. Awakening doesn't happen after thoughts disappear, but in the exact moment you notice. The space between them. It's like hearing a bell, not in the ringing, but in the silence it leaves behind. It's like seeing the stars. Only when the sky goes dark, we chase enlightenment, as if it's a destination, but often it's just a single breath, fully lived, a single pause, fully seen. Stillness doesn't mean the world stops. It means you stop chasing the world. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer pull you into their storm. Emotions still move through, but they no longer drown you. There is a gap now, a sacred pause, a moment of choice. And in that gap, freedom is born. Let's try something simple right now. Stop reading for just 3 seconds. Close your eyes. Let the next thought come, and watch it without chasing. Then notice what remains. When the thought is gone, that soft, subtle, spacious presence, that's you. That's the real you. Not the one wrapped in opinions or fears, but the one who witnesses it all. In silence, many people misunderstand meditation. They think it's about emptying the mind, or forcing silence, or achieving peace. But true meditation is gentle, effortless. It's not a doing, it's a resting. A resting in that sacred space, between thoughts, and in that resting, something begins to shift. The ego starts to loosen. Old wounds lose their grip. The noise softens. You begin to see that. You don't need to fix anything. To be whole, you don't need to become someone else. To be enough, in the silence between thoughts, you realize you were never broken, only distracted. The greatest teachings aren't found in words. They're found in stillness, between breaths, between sounds, between ideas. That's why silence has always been the path of the wise. Because in silence, truth doesn't shout, it whispers, and those who are quiet enough will hear it. Not everyone will understand this chapter of life. Some will run from silence, terrified of what they might find, but others, those ready to truly see, will discover that what they feared was never darkness, but the unfamiliar light of their own awakened mind. And once we begin, something shifts. It's subtle at first, like the moment a cloud thins, and you catch a glimpse of blue sky. You didn't create it, you didn't earn it, you simply noticed it was always there. This is what happens when awareness begins to awaken. It's not a dramatic explosion, not a lightning strike of enlightenment. It's quieter than that, simpler, more honest. It's the first real breath. After years of holding your lungs tight, it's the moment you stop trying and finally see, not the world, not others, but you as you truly are, unfiltered, unmasked, unclenched. And what you see is not what you expected, not a perfect, peaceful, enlightened being, but rather a confused, vulnerable, ever-shifting presence that has been hiding behind noise for so long. Yet somehow, this raw, open self feels more real than anything you've ever known. Awareness doesn't solve your problems. It doesn't erase your pain. It simply shines a light. And in that light, you realize the suffering didn't come from the world, but from the way you held the world in your mind. The pain wasn't just in the wound, but in your resistance to it, your story about it, your identity woven into it. Now for a moment, all of that softens, and you see things as they are, not through fear, not through craving, but through clarity. A child's laughter, the rustle of wind through leaves, The way your chest rises with breath, the quiet ache behind your eyes, all of it suddenly vivid. Even sadness becomes beautiful. When you no longer fear it, even emptiness feels sacred. When you no longer run from it. This is the first glimpse of truth, not a concept, not a belief, not a teaching in a book, but direct experience, undeniable, alive. Most people live like they're sleepwalking, eyes open but not seeing, hearts beating but not feeling, breathing but disconnected from breath. Awakening is not about becoming more, it's about becoming present. It's when the autopilot turns off, and suddenly, everything becomes vivid, colors seem brighter, sounds more layered, your own presence more grounded. You don't need to explain it, you just know. You're here now, fully, but here's the paradox. The moment awareness awakens, the ego panics, because when you glimpse your true self, you also begin to see how much of your life was built on illusion, all the roles you played, all the identities you defended, all the fears you obeyed, they begin to crumble. And for a moment, it's terrifying. Who are you without your story, without your masks, without your pain? It can feel like dying, and in some ways, it is, but it's not the death of you. It's the death of who you thought you were. You see, the mind isn't used to silence. It feeds on conflict, identity, and drama. So when truth begins to shine through, the mind resists. It tells you you're crazy. It tells you it's dangerous. It drags you back into the comfort of distraction. That's okay. This is not a war. You don't fight the mind, you simply see it, lovingly, patiently, like a parent watching a frightened child lash out. The first glimpse of truth is just that. A glimpse, not the whole path, not permanent peace, but a seed. And that seed changes everything, because once you've seen even a sliver of what's real, you can't unsee it. You may forget, you may wander, but something inside you has turned, and that turn is the beginning of freedom. Many spiritual seekers chase fireworks, visions, powers, peak experiences, but true awakening begins quietly, with one honest breath, one raw moment of seeing, 1 second of deep silence, in which you recognize yourself, not as a name, not as a role, but as awareness itself. And once that begins, you start to live differently. You begin to walk through There's something they don't tell you about waking up. It's not all light and bliss. It's not always peaceful. It's not some endless ocean of calm. Sometimes it hurts more than staying asleep, because once you wake up, you feel again. And not just joy, you feel the weight of years. You spent numb, the grief you buried, the anger you silenced, the loneliness you laughed through. It all returns, not to punish you, but to be healed. For so long you thought numbness was strength. You called it moving on, being productive, keeping it together, but numb wasn't healing, it was hiding, a subtle armor you didn't even know you wore. And when that armor starts to crack, everything becomes raw, sounds feel sharper, people seem louder, the world presses in. Even a small conversation can leave you exhausted because you're feeling now, fully, without filters. Most people avoid this. They take one glimpse of awareness and run back to distraction, back to noise, to scrolling, to endless busyness, because feeling life in full color means also feeling its pain. And truth be told, it's easier to stay asleep, but not better, because once you've tasted the aliveness on the other side of numbness, you know even pain, when felt fully, is more honest than a life lived half dead. You start to see that suffering wasn't the enemy, it was the doorway. All along it was trying to wake you, trying to show you what mattered, trying to lead you home. The aching in your chest, it was never something to avoid, it was a compass. And now, you're listening, but this path comes with a price. You lose the comfort of certainty. You lose the security of roles. You lose the lie that everything's fine. You begin to walk through life without a mask, and that too is a kind of loss. Because the old you, the one who smiled through the pain, who played along to fit in, that version of you starts to die. And death, even of an illusion, hurts, but in its place, something astonishing grows: presence, tenderness, courage. Not the kind of courage that fights dragons, but the quiet courage to sit still with whatever is here. Without running, you begin to feel others more deeply too. The friend who jokes too much, you feel the sadness under the laughter. The stranger who yells in traffic, you feel the fear beneath the rage. Even your own thoughts stop being enemies. They become old echoes, softened by awareness. And this is the miracle of waking up. You start to see everything, even suffering, as sacred, not because it's pleasant, but because it's real. Life becomes less about avoiding pain and more about meeting it honestly. And oddly enough, when you stop resisting the storm, you stop drowning in it, you learn to feel, without falling apart, to cry, without collapsing, to be vulnerable, without being weak. This is the path from numb to alive. And yes, it costs everything, but what you gain is beyond words. Not a better version of yourself, not a polished spiritual persona, but the most raw, real, wide-eyed version of you, the one that's been buried under layers of coping and pretending. You feel love more fully, not the romantic fantasy kind, but the trembling, wordless kind that rises up when you realize we're all just trying to be okay. You stop trying to be someone and start trying to be here, just here, alive, present, awake. And yet, just as you start to live with open eyes and an open heart, something begins to pull you back, not out of malice, but out of habit. That's when you face the next challenge, staying awake in a world that wants you numb again. There comes a moment, quiet and unremarkable, when you stop running, you just sit, you breathe, you feel the texture of the moment, as if life itself had been holding its breath, waiting for you to finally arrive. No future, no past. Just this breath, this sound, this heartbeat. And in that simplicity, you meet a presence so intimate, so clear, that it feels like looking into a mirror you didn't know was there. The mirror of the present. Mindfulness is not some technique. It's not a self-improvement hack. It's not another tool to optimize your life. It's the ancient, sacred art of coming home to what's already here, fully, unapologetically, with nothing to fix, nothing to change, just seeing, just being. But don't mistake simplicity for ease. To live with mindfulness means to stand face to face with the raw truth of every moment. No buffer, no filter, no hiding. You'll feel the beauty in a bird's call and the ache of your own emptiness. In the silence that follows, you'll feel joy ripple through your chest, just from sunlight hitting your skin, and grief surfacing for no reason at all. Because when you're truly present, everything is allowed to arise, and nothing is pushed away. The world doesn't change when you're mindful, but your relationship to it does. Suddenly, anger isn't something to unleash or suppress. It's something to observe. Pain isn't something to escape. It's something to feel. With tenderness, even boredom becomes a teacher. Whispering, "Can you stay here?" Even when nothing excites you, you begin to see how much of life you used to miss. Eating while distracted, walking while rushing, listening while thinking of what to say next. Now you slow down, you taste your food, you hear the wind, you actually see the faces of people you love, not through the lens of roles or expectations, but through the freshness of presence, as if meeting them for the very first time. Because in a way, mindfulness is not passive, it's not zoning out, it's the most radical form of participation. To be awake to your own life, to feel the rain, not as background noise, but as a sacred rhythm. washing your skin, to hear your child laugh, and realize that in that moment, nothing is missing, to sit in discomfort. And no, you don't have to escape it. That's mindfulness, not floating above life, but diving fully into it. But don't expect perfection. The mind will still wander, old habits will return, you'll still get lost. In thought, in fear, in desire, that's okay. The power of mindfulness isn't in never leaving the present. It's in remembering to return again and again and again. Each return is a small awakening, a quiet revolution against the forgetting, and over time, the present becomes less of a stranger. It becomes your home. You stop seeking miracles and start noticing them in the curve of a leaf, in the pause before a tear, in the warmth of your own hand, resting on your chest. You don't need to chase enlightenment. You need only to arrive, because the present isn't just a moment, it's a mirror, and in it, you see clearly the pain you carry, the love you forgot, the person you've always been, not the broken one, not the lost one, but the aware one, the witness, the stillness, the flame behind the eyes. But there's one thing this mirror reveals that most aren't ready to face: the illusion of the self we cling to. The next step on the journey isn't just presence, it's letting go of the one who's watching. There's a silence that doesn't come from absence, but from knowing, a stillness that isn't passive, but fully alive. And there's a freedom, not the kind stamped by governments, but the kind that arises when the walls of your mind collapse and you finally see, clearly, honestly, without distortion. This is where suffering ends, not in the changing of life's conditions, but in the ending of ignorance. For most of us, freedom has always seemed conditional. If I get that job, if they love me back, if my body feels better, if the past had been kinder, always if, always later. But awakening doesn't wait for the stars to align. It pierces through now, through this very breath, this moment of seeing, because what truly binds us isn't the world, it's the stories we believe about it. Ignorance isn't lack of information, it's mistaken identity. It's believing we are what we think we are: the body, the thoughts, the trauma, the success, the failure. It's the illusion that I am separate, a solid, unchanging self that needs to protect, acquire, and defend. And from that illusion, suffering blossoms like a shadow: craving, attachment, fear, control. But the truth is simpler, it's quieter, and yet infinitely more profound. You are not the thought that says I. You are the awareness, noticing that thought. You are not the sadness, you are the space in which sadness moves. You are not the fear, you are the witness that remains untouched. This isn't philosophy, it's direct experience, available in the stillness, between two breaths. So how does suffering end? Not by fixing every problem, not by becoming someone better, but by seeing through the illusion that created the problem in the first place. When the mind no longer believes its own drama, its grip loosens. When pain is no longer mine, suffering doesn't stick. When the self isn't so solid, neither are its chains. The Buddha didn't promise a perfect life. He promised liberation, not from pain, but from the identification with pain, not from change, but from resistance to change, not from death, but from the illusion that what you are could ever die. This is freedom, not loud, not flashy, but complete. And strangely, when ignorance falls away, what's left isn't emptiness, it's love, unconditioned, undirected, undeniable, a quiet love for all things, even the ones that once broke you. Because when you're free, there's nothing left to protect, no self left to defend, only presence, and the gentle curiosity of a heart no longer afraid to feel. You walk through the world the same way, but you're not the same. You listen more, react less, Speak from stillness. Act without seeking, not because you're trying to be spiritual, but because you've remembered what it means to be human, whole, aware, free. Suffering ends where ignorance ends. But the path is not a sprint. It's not a trophy to win. It's a deep returning to what's always been true, that underneath the fear, the craving, the endless noise, there is a silence that has never left you. And when you listen, truly listen, you hear it whisper, you were never broken, you just forgot who you were. And so the journey nears its close, not with fireworks, not with final answers, but with the quiet wonder of a mind that no longer needs to escape itself. What remains is a truth that words can't hold. But perhaps in the closing breath of this story, we can point to it one last time. There's a strange paradox in awakening. The more deeply you see, the less you feel the need to arrive. The more you understand, the more you realize there's nothing left to understand. And so, what once felt like a desperate search becomes a quiet walk, not chasing, not escaping, just walking awake. For so long, the spiritual path was imagined as a climb, upward, outward, toward some distant summit where suffering ends and peace forever begins. But awakening isn't a mountain, it's a mirror. And the deeper you go, the more you see that there's nowhere else to reach. Because you were never anywhere else. You were always here. The pain was here. The stillness was here. The confusion, the clarity, the fear, the love, it all arose in the same space. Your awareness, but only now do you meet it without turning away. Only now do you sit with it. Not to fix it, but to know it. That is the beginning of freedom, and freedom is not a moment, it's a way of being. Awakening doesn't make life easier, it makes you truer. You still lose things. You still feel pain, but you stop pretending you don't. You stop running, and in the stillness that follows, you begin to live from something deeper, something quieter than thought, softer than emotion, and stronger than anything the world can offer or take away. You speak less, but mean more. You react less, but feel more. You want less, but give more. And it's not because you're trying to be a better person. It's because you've stopped being someone else. You've stopped performing. And in the raw, open simplicity of being, you found what no doctrine, no teacher, no technique could ever give you: yourself, but not the self you thought you were. The self before the name, before the shame, before the roles and masks. The quiet one, the real one, the one who simply is. So where do we go from here? Back into the world, but not as who we were. We return lighter, softer, more honest, more alive. And we carry this light, not to preach, not to convince, but simply to be, because sometimes the deepest teaching is a silent presence. Sometimes the loudest truth is spoken without words. And sometimes all someone needs is to sit beside a heart that remembers. You were always home. You just forgot how to feel the floor beneath your feet, the breath in your lungs, the sky that never left you. Now you remember. And that's not the end. It's the beginning of the end, of illusion, of fear, of pretending, and the beginning of something real. If something in these words stirred something in you, if a quiet yes echoed inside, then this journey doesn't have to end here. There's more to explore, more to unlearn, more stillness to touch. So if this resonated with your heart, consider subscribing to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Here, we don't chase enlightenment. We remember it, one breath at a time, one story at a time, one silent truth at a time. Thank you for walking with us, truly.